Hello, my foodie geeks. Welcome back. And may I ask, have you listened to my introduction episode? No? Then you should give it a go because that's where I shared a bit about myself. And I also explained the concept of the podcast. And now we are on to episode 1. In this episode, I will explore how our ancestors recreated cassava recipes from their homeland. In the introduction video, I also explained that the podcast is about the ability of the enslaved Africans to recreate dishes, cooking techniques, and the use of spices all through remembrance. But the episode is not just about the recipes they memorized. I'll also dive into the way they adjusted these recipes to their new environment. And now, the slightly altered dishes serve as a channel through which we, as their descendants, can reconnect across continents and find our way back to the homeland of our ancestors. So, get comfortable, grab something to drink, or if you're listening while cooking, just get inspired and let's get started. Well, you may ask, why cassava? I hope you've had a chance to also watch my documentary about finding myself in Ingrisi Kunre. That's how it's called. It's also to be found on YouTube in the same via the same link where you can listen to this podcast. But anyway, I documented my journey of arriving in the UK and the way how I learned to adapt to ingredients available within the UK environment so that I could continue cooking my own Surinamese dishes. So I also had to learn about these new spices, and that's why I also made an effort to connect with other Surinamese people here in the UK. And this journey of mine, it never ended. I continue to find out about ways to recreate my own Surinamese dishes. It's my way of trying to create a space of belonging and comfort for myself and my husband. So, to hold on to our own Surinamese Creole identity, it's important for us because that makes us who we are. And it was through one of those food exploring adventures that I found out about fufu. That's the first time I also tasted it, and it reminded me of a dish a friend of mine once made in Suriname called huzaresla. So the original recipe for huzaresla is made with mashed potato, but my friend gave it a twist and made it with mashed cassava. So eating fufu reminded me so much of home. Cassava has always been part of my cooking and my memories of Surinamese food. There is no way you'll talk about the Surinamese Creole cuisine without mentioning cassava. My Surinamese people know what I'm talking about. So, when I learned about fufu and discovered the familiarity with our own use of cassava in Surinamese Creole cuisine, it was a sign for me to go and find out more about the way cassava became part of our Surinamese Creole cuisine. Now, the stories about the enslaved adapting some of the indigenous dishes and food practices, such as cassava, are known. For instance, we know about cassava bread in our own Surinamese Creole cuisine. But what is not sufficiently explored yet is the way how typical Surinamese Creole dishes are related to traditional food that's significant to some countries in the continent of Africa. I intentionally say some countries and not just one specific country in Africa, and the reason why is that we have now dismantled the long standing myth that our enslaved ancestors solely came from Ghana. Some still believe that. It is through various projects related to ancestry that I realized and discovered the connection with countries such as Togo, Nigeria, Benin, and even Sierra Leone. So, if I try to trace my ancestry, I look at the whole of Africa, to be honest, and that's going to be the same with me, connecting Surinamese Creole dishes to the African continent. Now let's go back to fufu. Once I realized the familiarity of this African dish with our own Creole dishes, I started to watch videos, documentaries. I looked up recipes of different African dishes, and I even tried to recreate these just so I could learn more about the use of African spices and African cooking techniques, and also other dishes that might show similarities with my own. So, fufu was one of the dishes I tried to recreate. And then I used cassava as my first primarily, basically, ingredient from an African dish to use it as a vehicle so I could explore this theory of our ancestors using their memory to continue recipes and cooking techniques from their own homeland. Okay, so to better understand the relation between the memory of our ancestors and their ability to continue recipes from their homeland, I am going to unpack the idea of memory from an anthropological point of view. I know. I have promised not to make this podcast too theoretical and academic. However, the anthropologist in me cannot help but still look for some anthropological spices so I can season our conversation. So, just so we can understand and justify how the practices of our ancestors' homeland have been preserved through food. Now, some of these anthropological theories or the notion of memory and the notion of social remembrance and that of habit memory. Now, in the notion of memory, there is this understanding that memories are activated through objects. So, through things we observe. And when I speak of objects in this case, I want you to picture our ancestors encountering things like plants and herbs and tools and spices and other food items in their new surroundings. So, another fact recognized by scholars is that our way of connecting with existing objects is through our senses. And according to one of the renowned anthropologists, that's David Sutton, who is one of my favorite, in the activation of a memory, it is not just the cognitive component that comes into play, but also the person's habituation to the environment. So, in simple words, the habits they have developed within the environment they live in, that is also important when it comes to understanding how memory is activated. Yeah? So Sutton speaks of other types of memories, such as those found sedimented in the body, ingrained in our bones. And then there is another anthropologist who discussed this idea of memory being ingrained in our body, and that is Paul Connaughton. He introduced the term habit memory, which is a term I like because it better explains why memory is of such importance when we recreate things. So, this form of memory was brought into context with ritual performances, as you can see, with actions, with practices, right? Things that we continue to do. It becomes a habit. And because it becomes a habit, we have it ingrained. It becomes ingrained in our body. And then another theorist who is Edmund Husserl, my tongue, please forgive me, decided to further explore the dynamics between our consciousness and the appearances of things. And he claimed that the objects which we preserve exist as they are, and through the meaning that each of us gives them. So, in other words, one specific object can have two completely different meanings in two totally different cultures just because the existence of that particular object depends on the meaning that has been imposed on it through the way it appeared to that person in a specific environment. I'm just going to give an example. In our case, again, when it comes to food. So let's think about the use of a wooden spoon, right? In our Surinamese Creole culture, wooden spoons are of such importance. And the meaning that has been given to a wooden spoon, I'm going to look at it in Suriname, is for it to be used in, for instance, the way how we mix the dough for cakes or other things that need to be baked, right? The wooden spoon seems to give that extra fluff to things. The same meaning can be given to a wooden spoon in a complete different country. An example, I got wooden spoons as a present from my friend from Czechoslovakia. Czechia. And in her culture, she explained, they only cook with wooden spoons. Nothing else than wooden spoons. It doesn't matter what kind of food is prepared, it's always with a wooden spoon. So this is where the theorists Paul Connaughton and Edmund are trying to show us that the meaning of an object can differ from the environment it is encountered, but also the persons who have given meaning to that specific object. And then Edmund further argues that we give meaning to an object not only based on our own personal point of view, but it's also rather a consensus that has been achieved through a collective viewpoint that represents a whole group and the culture we are part of. This is what makes us accept the meaning of the object. Again, I'm gonna go back to the use of the wooden spoon in the Surinamese Creole culture when baking cake in comparison to the use of wooden spoons in the Czechia culture, right? It is a collective viewpoint, it is a collective agreement to use the wooden spoon in a certain way when preparing. And for me, it was interesting to also look into the way how this collective viewpoint of meaning giving to a food item or an object related to food continued with the enslaved Africans through their memory. I will talk about that further down. So, if we go back to the purpose of my podcast, food evoked memories of home, and these memories became the vehicle through which connections were made with our ancestors and what they saw in the new land. So then they started to recreate, and they started to recreate to preserve the memory as well that was still carried in them. Remember the habit memory as part of who they are, who they really are, as part of their roots. And as such, Surinamese Creole food holds aspects of cultural traditions that represents the origins and the history of our enslaved Africans, but also those memories, those cultural traditions directly connect us with the place they came from. So it also vividly represents the dynamic and the active integration with other cultures surrounding them, surrounding those enslaved Africans during colonial times. And that's where recipes that they could remember from their homeland, home country, once adapted in the new land, in this case Suriname, it was altered through what they encountered in the environment, right? So, food is the most obvious symbolic evidence of the dynamic, fluid, and interactive processes of engagement that our enslaved Africans had with other cultures around them. That's why we can identify not just West African connections, but other connections as well with other cultures. So Surinamese Creole families, they pride themselves in possessing family recipes that have been transferred from generation to generation. And usually these family recipes hold oral stories and wisdom in how to apply or prepare certain herbs or spices. And they sometimes even hold life lessons that are attached to the way a certain dish should be consumed. So, this is how much memory means to us when we want to connect with the stories of our ancestors that are embedded in food. This is again proof on how memory served really as a vessel to carry on what they knew, what the knowledge that they had of the homeland. And all of that was then embedded in our case in food. That is why it is also easy to identify these similarities in dishes that were created in the new land, but still remind us of or familiar with dishes from the motherland, in this case, Africa. Okay, so now that we chewed through the theory about memory, and I hope it wasn't too much of a dense piece of meat to chew on, I want us to look at the techniques that are related to preparing fufu and how I observe the existence of similar techniques across continents. So, one of the theorists said that memory is cemented in the body. So, that means it's part of us. You once learned the skill and then you never unlearn it. One such skill that I noticed was the way the cassava would be pounded in a huge mortar. Pounding it in the wooden mortar with a large pestle while adding water. It's a very familiar scenery for us in the Surinamese Creole culture. And this is done just to reach that soft, smooth consistency that's so typical for fufu. As I said, it's a very familiar scenery for us in Suriname because in Suriname we also pound the cassava, mix it with green plantain, and then it's not too smooth. We don't pound it too smooth. But then we make balls, small balls from it, to then add it to a specific soup called pinda soup, peanut soup. And talking about the peanut soup, I came across this same peanut soup in the Ghanaian cuisine and even in Angolan cuisine. And that's another avenue to explore peanut soup. The correlation between peanut soup as part of our Surinamese Creole cuisine and the connection with African countries. This is how my mind continued to jump from one exploration to another discovery to another connection. Peanuts in this case. But again to the fufu and cassava because I am getting distracted again. That's exactly what happens when I talk about food. So let's go back. I want to draw your attention to the practice of pounding the cassava so it becomes a certain consistency that would allow to combine it with fluid food. That's where you see the remembrance coming into play again. The use of the large wooden mortar, the pounding of the cassava, and this idea of making it smooth so that it can be combined with other food substances. That's what is referenced when we talk about bodily remembrance, when we look at the way how cooking techniques were carried on through the memory of our ancestors and then transmitted from generation to generation. So, in our case, again, the pounding of cassava, but also the use of these large wooden mortars connects us again with practices from the homeland, from the place our ancestors came from. The idea of transferring, transforming cassava as a food item they encountered into a smooth consistency so that they could eat it, combine it with other dishes, is also another vehicle avenue that can lead us back to the roots of our ancestors. I hope you get a sense of how I am trying to explain the way how memory is a vehicle and is embedded in the food that we know today as being Surinamese Creole food, whilst it is also food that is very familiar to other countries, other cultures that actually connect us in a historical sense with each other. Creole food is enriched with a variety of other culinary influences. I said it before. The familiarity of Creole dishes with typical African dishes varies per geographical location. So let's look at cassava again, but then how it connects us with other African descents communities beyond Suriname. And I call it cassava beyond the motherland. Let's connect the dots. Let's look at another typical Surinamese Creole dish that is also made with cassava, and this is the dish called hirheri. It is made from provision, including boiled cassava, and then it's consumed with stewed, fried, or steamed fish. And the thing is, I saw this exact same recipe in Sao Tome and Principe. That's an island in the Gulf of Guinea in Africa, also an African descent community. Another one is cassava in the Caribbean cuisine, and that's going to lead us to a dish called cassava pone from Trinidad, which is almost like our own Surinamese Creole boyo that is made from grated cassava and coconut. And then I think it's time for us to look at cassava in Brazil. And here we are led to a traditional dish named pirão, sort of a thick cassava soup that is boiled with fish or shrimp. This dish can be compared to our own Surinamese Creole cassava soup, which is also thick and cooked with fish, meat, and sometimes even salted pork tail and salted beef. And I can go on and on and on about cassava dishes from other cultures that are similar to dishes from the Surinamese Creole cuisine. But the point I'm trying to make is that through cross pollination, our ancestors recreated their homeland dishes and then altered these recipes and they adjusted it to what was available in their direct environment. Yet, they made sure to remain connected to their motherland. And this is how they have gifted us this great opportunity of being able to travel back through these dishes and recipes and reconnect with the places they came from. Well, my foodie geeks, We have reached the end of this podcast. In another episode, I want to chat with you about the life lessons that are ingrained in these recipes and how we can recognize these life lessons in relation to food across continents. This is going to be more of a storytelling vibe where I'm going to share oral stories that are attached to certain recipes. So it should be more fun. I just wanted to use this first episode to give us more of a context, as in why I am looking at memory in relation to Creole dishes and how we can utilize memory as sort of a means of connecting with what our ancestors created as part of the food cuisine. So, again, this is going to be another way for us to follow our ancestors' memories, to reconnect with where they came from. And then in closing, I just want to invite you to share with me your own memories of cassava, but also do let me know what you think of the theories that I have applied to demonstrate how our ancestors stepped into their memories and recreated all these dishes that now help us to stay connected across continents as their descendants. I think it's cool and I think it's very fascinating, to go into finding ways to understand ways of sort of unpacking recipes and then try to connect the dots. So I hope you also enjoy it because that's what I did with the fufu. As I said, once I tasted it, it made me think about cassava, and that's how I went back into understanding cassava as one of those, food items that our ancestors recreated across the new continent, so to speak, they were brought to. So let's continue to connect, let's continue to tell their stories and bring light to their excellence in holding on to their own identity while passing it on through food. And I count on your contribution. Let's continue the conversation with Foodie Love. Bye.
Yo jelei de gonna boyo ala se panyi pangala.